Yeah, today I'm here to talk about Ansible. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get on with that. Yeah, so today my talk is Delta Ansible, keeping up with changes and deprecations. As Rafik introduced me, my name is Andrew Cziryak. I'm an infrastructure architect. Today I'm here representing compositional enterprises. I also do work at OCLC, not representing them today though. So this is not an introduction to Ansible talk. This is what you would need to know if you did your research at the big changeover from Ansible 1.9 to 2.0 and never really looked at the details again. So let's go ahead and dive in. A bit of an overview here. I'm going to touch on three major sections. First, the velocity section, then the currency, and then the sustainability. So the velocity section, I want to go over what Ansible provides for us, uh, where they show us in what direction they're heading, right, and the magnitude to which they are. For currency, I'm not talking about dollars or Bitcoin here. I'm talking about what does it take to get us up to uh, where Ansible is current, right, and how do we stay there. And sustainability will really drive that home with what things can we implement in order to stay on top of the changes and deprecations in Ansible. So to kick that off, let's start with velocity, which, as we all know, is how quickly and which direction. So let's go ahead and set our pace with that discussion. Um, there are a couple things that Ansible provides to us to keep up with what they're doing and to be transparent. Mainly, what we need to be focused on, we as systems administrators, mainly, right, and anyone really who else is needing to work with Ansible, it's going to be mainly minor versions that make the difference. So they are going to be introducing a lot of the new fixes into minor versions, and this does follow semantic versioning. So 2.x being 2 being the major version and x being the minor version. So every time they increment that, they will have release notes that go along with all of those releases to give us information as to what is being provided to us in this new version of Ansible. And I'll get to that in a second here. Just to set the pace here, the new stable version, which would be that new minor version, is released at a pace of about every 6 months. Now, most recently with the release of 2.10, they did miss that goal. I believe that's still in beta right now, but they do aim towards about every 6 months releasing a new stable minor version of Ansible. And if we go through the list here that I have up on the screen, we can see exactly which minor versions get which support. Ansible actually only uh, maintains the latest three stable versions. So at this snapshot, they were maintaining 2.8, 2.9, and 2.10. So those were considered the stable versions. 2.10 obviously is still in the alpha beta phase, and it's getting all the new updates and fixes and stuff. So that would be the most heaviest change, the most change heavy of all the minor version releases. 2.9 is getting a lot. It's getting security and general bug fixes, but any kind of new feature or any kind of feature tweak isn't necessarily getting into that minor version. So you're still fairly stable and fairly supported on that version. 2.8 being the third release back, that is only getting security updates. It's not getting any kind of bug fixes. It's not getting any kind of uh, uh, advantages there. It's just getting the security fixes, and then everything else beyond that is actually end of life. So if you're running any of those older versions as you go forward, those will be unmaintained. If there's anything that's unearthed or any security vulnerability that comes into play there, you're going to have to bump up to the latest supported version in order to get those fixes. Um, Another thing that Ansible provides us are the roadmaps. The roadmaps show us, what's ahead of us, and Ansible kind of tries to fit everything in there. Since 2.10 though, roadmaps have actually been broken into Ansible Core and Ansible the engine itself. So we'll go into talking about collections in a second here and the change that introduced. But there are roadmaps that show us kind of what's coming up next. It's grouped into each minor version release. As we talked about, the minor versions are really where all the big changes are going to be happening. The releases get dated and categorized, and these go back all the way to the 2.0 release. So if you want a historical view of what's been changed, or say you have an implementation where you're kind of stuck on running an older version, you want to get it up to date, you'll have all those roadmaps that will show you what's been implemented in the previous version, so you can almost step through those updates, if you will. So and taking it straight from their documentation, each roadmap offers a best guess based on the Ansible team's experience and on requests and feedback from the community of what will be included in a given release. So they are continually, it's a living document. They are continually changing these and updating them, making sure they're up to date. The next, and I would say most important thing here, are the porting guides. So we talked about the roadmaps and what features would be included. The porting guides are for us, for the community, for how to implement these features, right? They show us how to remediate as well as take advantage of new functionality of playbooks, right? Personally, it's how I stay up to date on what the latest way to do something is, right? So there are a couple sections that they'll typically include. One is going to be the playbook changes, any changes that were made to the command line client, any kind of deprecations, module changes, additions, any plugins and custom scripts. So even they don't guarantee their internal code to be consistent, right? They kind of mold it as they need to, but anything big like callback scripts or any other kind of plugins that would be necessary, they'll give you a little hint as to if something really big changed. So they're pretty good about doing that. And they really learned that from the 1.9 to 2.0 release. If anyone was back in that time, there was a really, really huge jump in functionality that broke just a lot of things. So at this point, they're really covering their tails here and making sure that they be as transparent as they possibly can. So the porting guides are just an excellent opportunity to take advantage of that transparency, right? Deprecations are very important in Ansible because if something is deprecated, obviously it's not going to be available. But let's walk through how they deprecate something. So the first thing that happens if they're going to deprecate something is then a feature is marked as deprecated, accompanied by warnings to the user when you're actually running Ansible, any alternatives to switch to, and a release when the feature will be removed indefinitely. So they'll give you plenty of heads up, and they'll give you plenty of resources in order to remediate that. And when the feature will be removed indefinitely is in the 4th feature release. So the 4th minor version release after the deprecation was posted, they will actually remove that version. So if you consider that a minor version comes out every 6 months, you'll have more or less 2 years before you will need to remediate that deprecation, which is not a bad time frame, right? It's something, obviously if you get comfortable with a functionality, you're not looking at it, you're not monitoring these deprecations, you may be surprised by it, but if you're able to stay on top of it, they do give you enough time to address it. For example, something in 2.5, something that's deprecated in 2.5 will be removed in 2.9. So let me touch on a couple of major changes that have made a difference in my life working with Ansible. And I'm just going to run through these really quick. It'd be easier if I had like demo code and could show you what the difference is here, but we're not going to go into that depth today. Just a couple things to touch on here. The fact that blocks could have names in 2.3, right? That was big because in Ansible, you want to name everything. It's like their internal comment system. If you don't comment something, you don't know what it does. So if you can't name something, that's going to be a huge disability. So being able to name blocks was a good step forward there. The next one was Python 2.6 was actually required on the targets servers. If you're just talking about regular Linux servers, starting at 2.4 and beyond. This broke backwards compatibility when you're talking about working with CentOS 5 and older. That's been end of life for several years now. So why you're still working with that? I mean, it needs to start being a business decision at that point. But Ansible is going to force the issue as well and make that also a tooling discussion, because Ansible is not supporting those with older Python versions only. Migrating from with X to loop. So if you need to loop over something in Ansible, the old way to do it prior to 2.4 was with items, basically. And they migrated that to using loops, which was nice. And to get into internal baseball here, they wanted to use more of the Jinja filters when it came to looping over stuff. So loop actually implements that interpolation within the loop. So you can loop through something and you can pass a variable into a Jinja filter, and that will perform what the with items or with sub elements or whatever one of the with commands did previously. Uh, and then skipping the rest of these, the most major one to come out recently was Ansible Collections. Now this was actually released in 2.9. So this is available as a minor release already and has been for the past couple of months. Ansible Collections splits up the modules from the actual core engine of the program, what actually runs the code on the remotes. So the collections, if I could just stop and touch on that for a bit, benefits the broader community in that anyone can write their own custom modules and not have to have them included in the Ansible core team's release of Ansible, right? The Ansible core team's release of Ansible is now just the engine part of it. Any kind of module or custom Python code or anything else that can be run on the remote, that can be written separately and brought in via the collection system to any Ansible implementation that you're running. That's really great if you want to write custom modules. It's really bad if you need to transition into 2.10, which is where the majority of the community is. Now, for the typical the file module, the line and file module, the shell module, all of that, that's not going to require any rewriting. However, the third-party supplied modules, like if you're doing network stuff with F5, right, or you're doing stuff with DigitalOcean, those are going to be now third-party curated collections that you're going to need to import. Now, a raw install of Ansible will import those all initially for you, but you're going to want to take a look at your code to see if you need to update them. And I'm not going to go deep into collections today, but while it does allow third-party developers to have a lot easier way to bring in their stuff, it may require some updating code and module naming conventions in order to make sure that that still works going into 2.10 and beyond. So keep an eye out for that. I might dive into that later, either later this year if I give another talk, or maybe even next year. I bet I could fill up an entire talk about collections. So I'm going to leave it at that for the time being, and we're going to transition into currency, which is how to catch up, right? If you're on an older version of Ansible, what would be required in order to get you to be current, right? So I love this picture. I found this picture a while ago, and I think it just illustrates the point perfectly. So if we take a look at this guy, right? He's obviously driving an old whatever Model T to work, and he, it's a vast improvement over what he had available to him otherwise. It'd either be some other form of transportation, so like a horse or something, or just walking to work, right? So it's definitely an improvement over his alternatives at the time, but there was a lot of room for additional improvement, right? So like if you'll note the distinct lack of seatbelts or doors or an automatic transmission, right? So there's a lot that you can improve, but someone had said, you know what, I could probably stop all of the bugs from getting in my face if I put up a windshield, right? So they made that little improvement. They're like, okay, let's add a windshield first, and then get to all the other things down the road. And that's kind of where the broader ecosystem was at 1.9. Like they had a working engine, right? And they had a windshield to kind of protect them from the biggest issues, right? But there was a lot of improvement to do. They certainly weren't driving a Tesla, right? I can at least tell you that. So what did Ansible need to do? Well, they had to go up against all the other tools that were on the market and start implementing the stuff that these other tools had as well, right? So they had a lot of hurdles to cross on the road to adopting or getting into environments that had existing technology stacks in them, right? And whether the newfangled stuff like multi-cloud or whatever ends up actually being a thing, right? We have reliably proven time and time again, right, that the right tool for the right job is always going to be the right answer, right? It's never going to be one overarching tool. So how does Ansible kind of fit into this, right? So there are times and processes and even culture, right, where that's built around existing tooling, right? If we go back to DevOps mantra of people and processes and tools, right? It's not just the tools part of it. There's people and processes as well. So we have to think about that whenever we think about, all right, how do we make sure Ansible can stay up to date in this type of ecosystem, right? You can't just, pull out the rug from additional tooling. You can't just, and expect all the people and processes to be fine in them, right? It's something that, orchestrator, right, if you're in a VMware environment, can play a crucial role in the overall flow of things, right? It can be integral to the workflow and even really the cohesivity of the team itself, right? So then we start to talk about, well, what's the processes then, right? So we take a look, and I have a picture of the old Smith Brothers hardware company building in Columbus up there. That that building has bones, and you can just tell kind of by looking at it. It's a cool looking building. It's got the facade, it's got the framework, it's got all the internal stuff, and the foundation is solid too, right? So none of those things are bad, but they could be viewed as legacy, right, or something to work around, right? So if you look inside the building, I mean, it's beautiful in there, it's gorgeous, and it's modern too, right? But there had to be creative ways that were found to work around what needed to stay there, or what even could stay there. If you look at the little slide shoot down at the bottom left, I mean, that's a pretty cool feature. You're not going to find that anywhere in Silicon Valley because they didn't have that. It's an homage almost to the legacy of this building, right? Having a greenfield environment, like even if you see on the right hand side, that's almost an impossibility, right? You're still going to have the environment around it, and everyone kind of brings their own baggage to the table, whether that's previous experience with other tools or other sorts of biases, right? So there's no real idea of a greenfield. You're going to have to grow up Ansible around these other tools and these people and these processes, right? So, and even kind of bringing it back to Ansible, what does that mean? Well, that could be, if someone has their own favorite module, right? Maybe it's been deprecated, but they're clinging onto it for dear life, right? Or they have hard coded IPs or host names in their playbooks, or they're using the old key equals value formatting, right? So how do you start addressing those things without being overbearing, and how do you work Ansible up to the point that it needs to be? Well, there's a couple of things here, and it's the best way to get legacy mindset into the open is to be open and to share stuff with people, which is scary, right? The best place to start doing that is going to be within the code. And to all the people who had the idea flashing in their heads that Ansible is not code, I promise you Ansible's code. Ansible's code as much as Kubernetes code is code, right? YAML can be understood to be configuration, but in my world, it's the code that actually runs my life. So don't let anyone tell you anything different, at least not without really diving into it. So with that in mind, we have to treat our code like code. We have to review it, and we have to test it. We have to version it, right? We have to have those things in order to get our code up to the point where it's production, and that we all kind of have an understanding of what our environment looks like. Now, best practices are going to be a step forward in that, almost as a result of doing that. If we're reviewing code and I see someone's ignoring an error, right, I can now start to address that. I can say, I can bring up those situations and scrutinize some of the ideas or the decisions that have been made previously. If you have those key equals value formats within Ansible, I mean, that's legacy. It still works. Don't get me wrong, it still works, but it's legacy. What is your priority to get that current, to get that to the currently supported version of what kind of the broader ecosystem can can tolerate, or well, is moving towards, right? And the last thing, this is more of a personal pet peeve of mine, so I'm gonna spend a little bit talking about this. Clutter. If you version control something, and this is once again going back to the result of if we treat code like code, we reap the benefits of doing so, right? One of it is cleaning out the clutter. And the clutter, we don't need scripts that have uh, extensions of OMG do not use on it, right? We don't need these 1600 playbooks, 1658. I don't need that many playbooks to do what I do. I promise you I don't. And if you do start looking into roles, it's going to be a much better option for you. Um, but we can get rid of that clutter if we start version controlling it. The minute we start version controlling it, that clutter gets gone, right? I understand keeping it around for historical purposes, right? But that's what version control allows us to do. It allows us to put it to the side and say, okay, if we need to historically go back and see what this was actually doing, we have it in our history. We can absolutely continue to access it. So treating code like code, the top point there is going to reap us the benefits of improving this and getting us to the point where we can start getting better at things. So there are a lot of ongoing opportunities that I've observed personally and professionally, right? One of them is tech debt. Tech debt is very hard to address, and it's very easy to accrue. Right? So how do you start tackling tech debt? Well, if we treat code like code, then we can say, okay, if we're reviewing the new, uh, if we're reviewing the new stuff that's going in there, right? We can see if we're ignoring stuff that we don't need to be ignoring, or if there's an exception in our environment that maybe we need to remediate first. There are things that we can address as we go through the review process as we're treating code like code. Whether it's not working, or if there's deprecation warnings or formatting warnings, right? We can take a look and we can revisit that code. Sometimes you just want to revisit code just for the heck of it, just to say, when I was thinking, 6 months ago, a year ago, when I was thinking about implementing this, did I do it in the correct way? I mean, is it still relevant today? For instance, there is a part in my one of my playbooks where I reboot a server using a shell command and then a wait for, right? And I implemented that before the reboot module came along. And now I can go back and revisit it and say, hey, there's a way for me to do this better, right? Why wouldn't I do it? Well, yeah, it's tech debt. It's going back and revisiting code. In having those eyes on the code, though, treating code like code, being able to review it and have people look at it, right? That's going to start coming to the forefront, right? And another way to do that is updating standards, right? So if we have a standard of how to do something, then we can say, hey, this doesn't meet our standard. Let's go ahead and tweak it, right? And my favorite way to do that is to curate skeletons and say, hey, this is how we do a loop, and just have a little snippet, just a little file in a skeletons directory, and say, hey, this is how we loop over something. We use the loop command. We use Jinja filters, giving examples, right? Or in order to access a variable in a JSON format, how do you do that? And I'm fairly good at Ansible just because I've had the experience that I've gone through this time and time and time again, right? People who don't necessarily have that aren't necessarily as familiar, and can benefit from having a reference point of view, as I can every now and then, and say, this is, I know I solved this problem once, right? I know I've solved this problem once. Let me go back and see how I did it. So curating skeletons will kind of get us to the point where standards are maintained, right? And then, as we're revisiting code, we can make those call outs and say, hey, this is not how we do a loop, right? Or this is not how we access a variable, right? We have standards, we have skeletons here to demonstrate that standard. One of the a couple of the cool things that I've seen around the Ansible community that has made all of that very easy for me is that, for the most part, new versions of Ansible just work, and that has really made all the difference. It's obviously way more of a testament to the team than anything I've ever accomplished. And if you look in the slide, I do have a screenshot of the contributors based on lines of code added to the Ansible core engine. So these guys are the real MVPs here. So their standards as well have been ever evolving, and via the porting guides, for instance, when I was talking about they had defined the way to use the loop command instead of the with items, that was them updating the internal standards, and they make sure to have that decent documentation in order to keep us as a community up to date, right? Code review is yet another great way. And you know, I feel like I'm kind of hammering this a little bit, and I promise you I am, for a reason, right? Because code review is going to be the thing that gets other people's eyes on your code, and that gets you more knowledge base around not only the environment by having other people's feedback, right, but other people's point of view into the code itself, if they have a better way to do it, or even if they have questions for clarification. That's always going to be something that has the ability to trigger a thought. So getting other people's eyes on your code is one of the most important things you can do, and I will continue to hammer it for the rest of as I'm in the industry. So let's go to sustainability. So say we've got all these processes in place, right? How do we keep on top of things, given that things keep changing? Now, if I had my way, we would just not change. Like that would be fine. If I could just stop it right there, that'd be great. But things continue to change. So how do we keep up with that? Well, we have to start testing. And I might have lost half of us here, but hear me out here. So testing, in a sense that there's a way to do testing that's fully implemented like this, where we have, you know, a beautiful front end, and we have a dedicated test cluster, and you know, we have reporting results that are for the majority green, right? Usually stuff doesn't end up like this. This is more akin to what I'm using in production, where I manually kick off jobs and a hack together Java front end held together by Python code, which runs on servers that are probably not production and stores its results to an Apache server that generates Excel reports that are mostly red. It's not the greatest, most pure setup, but it works, right? It still does work. I'm still able to get the results, and I'm still able to start seeing, all right, where are my deprecations, right? Where are my warnings? Where are my actual failures, right? You know, I don't ever think I've used the word glamorous to describe it, but it's a step in the right direction. So what do we need for testing, right? How do we analyze a test, you know? And I'm incredibly lazy, right? So I'm probably not hitting all the bullet points here, but I wanted to take a step back and kind of divvy this up to say, what kind of testing do we need to determine how to stay current with Ansible? Well, the first question is, did it run successfully? If we can't answer yes to that, the rest of the questions are moot, right? So let's start our testing there. Did it run successfully? And then if it did run successfully, did it run successfully again, right? Ansible as a program is written in order to be idempotent, right? So if it can't run again idempotently, right, then we have to address, all right, is that a problem, right? And it may not be, right? It may not be, which is why I put this question second, because it may not be a problem if it didn't run successfully the second time. But if it didn't run successfully the first time, that's a big red problem. We need to address that. Now, okay, say all that got analyzed, and we say, what do we move on to now? Say we can run our playbook successfully. Now what? Well, we go into the integration testing part of it, right? Which is basically us looking for any anomalies here. So did it throw any errors or any warnings, right? And this isn't hard. This is just a slight step above. Did it actually run, right? If we're using, you know, failed when, or if we're using those statements to ignore errors, right? Why are we ignoring them, right? Is there a better way to do something? Is there a more built-in way to do something? If we're running, you know, raw sed commands, is there a way that, because that will give a warning, right? Is there a way to use a line in file rather than sed, right? So did it throw any warnings, or were there any errors that we ignored that we might want to readdress going forward? So those are two big things. Those are where the vast majority of our improvements are going to be made. If you think about deprecation warnings, right, and formatting warnings, stuff that is continually changing will be caught in this step. So if you stop there, you're pretty much where you need to be, right? The next step being, did we end up with a server that does what we need? And then we start talking about testing framework like PyTest or Test Kitchen or any of those other frameworks where you can implement a big suite about how to work with that. And let's see, did I just crash?
Andrew, you're fine.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Sorry about that. All right. So acceptance testing, right? So that's going to be the big part that we really probably don't need. So integration testing is going to be what we're looking for mainly. So if we get there, we'll be pretty good. So how do we get there? Well, the remediation comes with code reviews and reading the documentation, right? And I told you it feels like I'm harping on code reviews, and I really am. If someone brings you a problem and they say that they ran into a problem, you can't just tell them no, you're wrong, right? That's not a problem. And if it's not a code problem, let's take a look at the people and processes and see if the problem lies in one of those two. I bet that it does. So if we start taking look at those problems, if we start diving into code review, getting other more people involved, right? The most effective way to get them talking is to get them to look at what you changed and get them to look at what you added. If something's working, right, the impetus to review it is very, very low. Unless in my case it's bugging me in the back of my head and saying, hey, you need to go change that module, right? The impetus to actually take a look and review something that's actually working is very, very low. So if you can get people to look at what you changed and what you added, that's going to be the easiest way to get people interested in looking into the code, right? They get exposure to what you're doing, what you're adding, kind of the framework you're working within, and you get another set of eyeballs about what's going on in your code, and everybody wins in that case. And like I said before, the porting guides and the release notes are going to be your first go-to to say, what changed, how do we get stuff up to date, what is best practices. They're going to be all pretty much outlined there. So lastly here, and it's funny, I've been in the chat today talking about business decisions, and when do we actually get time to do this code? When are we going to be able to address these things, right? And if you don't get buy-in from the business, your team is never going to get time to conduct code reviews. They're never going to get resources to spin up automation front ends or support for testing those safety checks or the automated testing, anything even close to that, right? So you're gonna have to convince people that it's worth it, right? So there are 3 points to touch on here. The first one is the first major problem you'll run into is, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Well, let's take a look at broke. Why? What is broke? How do we define broken, right? What is it broken when a playbook only works a third of the time? Is it broken when it only works less than 100% of the time? What in between there is acceptable? Is it broken if we're only using a supported insecure version? Or if it takes an hour to do something that really should only take 5 minutes? Is that broken, right? If you start redefining broken for, there's you're going to have a myriad of reasons why keeping up is necessary, right? And the way to figure those out is testing. Testing can reveal just how broken things actually are. Complexity, man. The only way to get reliability for your team, or readability at least for your team, reliability for the business, and security for the security audit team, is to limit your complexity, right? You need to step back and reevaluate to figure out, do I actually need all of this in my code? And that will reduce your bust factor, right? And it'll get you goodwill with your team. Like, I can't afford to be the guy that introduces complexity, because if I'm out in the Bahamas, which would be cool, not really, but if say I'm out in the Bahamas, I don't want to get called because I'm the only one who can fix code. And that brings us to the first thing too. If it's broken, is it broken if I'm the only one who can fix the code? I would say absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. So that brings us to the last one. I mean, that's us staying within support. If I don't know what the broader community is saying about their support, right? If I'm still using key equals values pairs, and I try to post that in an IRC or in mailing list or something, or I'm using an old unsupported version, the first thing I'm going to get told is, hey, looks like you're having a problem, but you're not even using a supported version. I can't really, there's nothing at this point that I can do. If you were to upgrade it, maybe we can start trying to figure out your issue here, or maybe that could solve it. So the first thing you want to do before you reach out to someone is to make sure to stay within support. And you always want to have that lifeline. You always want to have that lifeline. You never want to be the guy to go in and say, well, I'm the last line of defense here. That's almost never going to work. So in order to stay within support, well, in order to push your code as a business decision, make sure you stay within support to have someone else to fall back on. So let's sum it up today. We went through a lot of things today. And what do we expect to have at the end of the day, right? And is it worth it, right? I would say it's absolutely worth it, right? It's worth it in money and time and energy, right? So it's worth it in money in the sense that I'm right now doing the job of 3 FTEs, right? And getting compensated for it, right? It's worth it in time because, I'm doing what used to take 2 to 3 FTEs to do, and I'm doing it in an automated, repeatable manner. I can depend on that to be repeatable, right? And it's worth it in energy because I'm not just pouring my energy into these systems, into this environment. It's going into learning better practices, right? It's going into communicating better with my team, and it's going into sharing my knowledge with other people. That's the best thing that I can do with my time and my energy. At that point, the money becomes a side effect, right? So I firmly believe that there's nothing better that I could be doing than be keeping up with the changes and deprecations in Ansible. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks, Andrew. Obviously, you covered a lot of stuff. And I am like others, probably just catching up on everything. But I do see one question in the QA window, which is basically Chris is asking that how would you counter organizations? There are sometimes organizations are resistant to change, and they want to just continue doing what they're doing, and they may view Ansible as adding another layer of complexity. So how would you counter that argument?
Yeah, since I have a minute or so here, I'm going to go ahead and read the question itself from Chris here. So, how are you counting organizational trends that resist standardization and might view the use of Ansible as adding another layer of complexity before they've upskilled? I.e., when they're starting out, they will be able to do things much faster natively than if they used Ansible as an abstraction on what they're doing. That is that is the automation question, though, isn't it? So I would say, well, back to the business decision, right? And are we able to make a business decision on this, right? Are we able to say, our processes are broke, right? In the sense that, I have a coworker getting up at 2 a.m. 3 times a week in order to fix the backup procedures, right? Is that something we're considering broken, right? Are we putting in 70 hours a week because we're doing manual native efforts, right? Is this leading to more complexity? Is this a bus factor for us, right? And we have to put that in terms of business decisions. We can't make a persuasive argument unless we can either put money or man hours behind it. If you can start making that argument, there will be some forward progress towards implementing automation systematically.
Very good. Thank you. We are right on the time. Thanks for wrapping it up.